Sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday morning, you'll get an email from the Washington Times, where I'll share the stories behind the stories we talk about on the podcast. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter every Friday at historyasithappens.com. History as It Happens, December 8th, 2022. Voices of Iran.
She was attacked after being arrested by the morality police. They say she died.
Iranian forces are using bullets and tear gas on anti-government protesters.
The regime cracked down on protests in 2009 and again 10 years later.
This is the Iranian people standing up with extraordinary courage for the rights that are being denied.
Security forces have stolen the body of a 16-year-old protester and buried her secretly.
Security forces have killed a dozen people in the last 24 hours in a crackdown on demonstrators.
Well, today, before their match with England, the Iranian squad chose not to sing the country's national anthem.
Because this is about Iran's struggle, the struggle of the people of Iran for the fundamental freedoms that have long been denied them.
Since September, ordinary Iranians have risked their lives and hundreds have lost their lives, protesting against their regime's cruelties after the death of a young woman in the custody of the morality police. Maybe the most significant challenge the Islamic Republic's rulers have faced since their revolution in 1979. But will it, can it, lead to change? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Iran is a post-revolutionary society. That's one thing it has in common with the United States. I know that seems like a strange analogy. I wouldn't want to push it too far because, of course, our revolution here in the United States is much, much older and, of course, very, very different in nature. But the reason I make that analogy is that in all countries really that have a sort of foundational myth of any kind, but particularly strongly in post-revolutionary societies, symbolic demonstrations of those kinds of revolutionary ideologies are very, very difficult to just kind of remove.
You'll remember a couple episodes ago we talked about the remarkable scenes unfolding in China. Ordinary citizens defying their authoritarian regime's COVID controls and also demanding fundamental change, the end of the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Well, for the past several months, ordinary Iranians, spurred by the death in police custody of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, have done the same to their government. Amini was arrested by the morality police for not wearing her hijab the way the clerics say all women have to wear it. Her death was like a match to kindling doused in lighter fluid. Iranians, beset by any number of problems caused by their rotten government, exploded in anger. This video, posted to YouTube by Iran Wire, shows Iranians chanting, "Our disgrace is our incompetent leader." Later in the video, the chant is, "Death to the dictator, be it Shah or Ayatollah." U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken offered these remarks on the protests at a recent meeting with Iranian civil society activists in Washington.
This denial of fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms, is something that the United States has long worked against, as have many other countries around the world. But first and foremost, this is the Iranian people standing up with extraordinary courage for the rights that are being denied them. We've worked to support those who are standing for their fundamental freedoms despite the efforts of the regime to deny them the ability to assemble, to speak freely, to communicate with each other. We've imposed sanctions on the so-called morality police that are engaged in incredibly abusive practices.
Now, we should note that large-scale demonstrations are more frequent in Iran than, say, in China. Iranians protested the 2009 election results, and then in 2019, soaring fuel prices led to more demonstrations. Discontent with the ayatollahs' rule simmers just below the surface. And it just takes one more outrage to spark nationwide upheaval. But through it all, the regime has endured. Why? As you've heard me say many times here, everything happening today comes from something, somewhere. It's why this podcast is dedicated to examining the recent past to try to make sense of what's happening today. And in this episode, that recent past is 1979 onwards. Historian John Ghazvinian is the executive director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the author of a must-read book, America and Iran, A History from 1720 to the Present. And he's become a regular guest on the podcast. John Ghazvinian, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And season's greetings to you as well while we're at it.
Same to you.
So let's begin with this, an article at abcnews.com. It says, Iran experts have said the protests, which have unified a diverse range of Iranians, pose the biggest challenge the regime has faced since the revolution in 1979. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say the biggest challenge the regime has faced since the last challenge the regime faced. It's a frequent occurrence. The Islamic Republic has faced quite a few challenges since its creation in 1979. This is certainly one of the most significant. I think it's fair to say that the Islamic Republic is probably at the lowest point of its popularity at this point. Or put another way, it has never been so unpopular. You know, it's a different kind of challenge. A lot of the other challenges that it has faced have either been external or one-time events, wars. You know, they have faced popular uprisings and protests before. This is certainly not the first time they have. Though I think there is a level of frustration and outrage and even desperation among the young, especially, that is difficult to know what to do with, I think, if you're in their shoes. So I think this is a particularly challenging, I mean, not necessarily in the short term. I actually am not one of these people that thinks that the Islamic Republic is on the imminent verge of collapse. But I do think that in the medium to long term, there are some structural challenges being presented here that it needs to figure out some way to deal with.
Yeah, I just did an episode about the protests in China, and one of the themes I explored in that conversation was, can the protests grow? What mechanisms are available to people to bring about some type of change, short of, toppling the entire regime, which, as we know, is very difficult to do. There were 2009 election protests, and then in 2019, more protests in Iran about high fuel prices. But it seems to me, and you would know better than I, that there's always popular discontent simmering just below the surface. One more outrage is all it takes to spark widespread demonstrations. Is that what you see happening here?
I think we're in an interesting moment in history. And I guess this is a very historian type of answer. Of course, I'm a historian. But I think what we've seen over the past decade is a real question mark over the ability of popular protests to actually overthrow regimes. I think that there was a moment about 10 years ago after the Arab Spring, or even after the 2009. Well, let's leave that aside for a moment. I think there was a moment around the time of the Arab Spring where it really looked like we were in a moment of extraordinary popular sovereignty, popular will, overthrowing regimes that had become encrusted and ossified and entrenched over decades. It didn't quite work out that way. And we've seen a number of protest movements since in many parts of the world that have also not succeeded ultimately in achieving their objectives. If the objective is, fundamental change and fundamental regime change and so on. You could argue that they've achieved their objectives in the sense of drawing attention to the issues, getting authorities to pay more attention to grievances, etc., perhaps, or international community to develop more solidarity. But if the goal is to actually overthrow the system of government, we haven't seen a lot of examples where popular protest has actually been able to do that. And I think there's a little bit of, I don't want to say protest fatigue, but I think that internationally, you don't see the same level of electrified attention being paid attention to some of these protest movements. Even the one in China, I mean, it's unprecedented, of course, in a lot of ways since Tiananmen. But is anyone seriously predicting the downfall of the Chinese Communist Party? I don't think so. And honestly, I don't think any really informed observer is predicting the imminent downfall of the Islamic Republic either. And you can say that in a number of other contexts in other parts of the world as well. It's a reflection in many ways of, I think, other trends. I mean, I think as the internet and social media created a sense of optimism and a kind of public sphere, maybe a decade or two ago, I think in the early 2000s, even around 2010, there was a feeling that, social media and the internet is going to liberate all of us. It has an incredible democratizing impact. And I think a lot of that spilled over into the optimism that people felt about protest movements. But I think what a lot of us have seen over the past 10 years is that a gradual closing off of space, actually, or a certain kind of public impotence that also goes along with social media, that it is not the answer to everything. That, yes, it may make protest easier, protest movements more facilitated, But, governments are also savvy about how to crack down on these things.
Absolutely. Authoritarian regimes can control the internet, and they're also willing to use force, spill blood to put an end to protests. That's what's happening in Iran.
And you can also use social media and the internet to put out their own narratives, to sort of confuse matters as well. So
I want to talk about the 2009 protests about the election, but I was just thinking of 1985. In the Soviet Union, there was no mass movement. There was no popular uprising against the regime. The changes happened from within the Communist Party, which was not monolithic, despite what Reagan and Thatcher may have thought of it. But then Gorbachev and his reformers took power, and they eventually accelerated their reforms, such as freedom of speech, freedom of publication. That fueled popular ferment that helped bring down the state. No country, no government is a monolith. So inside the Islamic Republic, are there more pragmatic or reform-minded people who say, want to listen to what the people are saying right now, or are they just hardliners?
Those people have very much been sidelined over the past 10, 12 years or so, especially since 2009. Unfortunately, the reform movement in Iran has found itself on the wrong side of everybody, in a sense. Those who are more democratically aligned or inclined, a lot of the people who you now see protesting are people who have completely given up on the possibility of reformist leaders like Mohammad Khatami or Hassan Rouhani, the former presidents, or Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister. Those kinds of figures are actually loathed by a lot of sort of anti-regime protesters today because they're seen as sort of quislings who have facilitated the regime, and they're also loathed by hardliners as being people who've been naive and have unwittingly paved the way for foreign-inspired turmoil and chaos in the country, and so on and so forth. So they have very few allies. They're very marginalized. They've gone very quiet in recent years. The Islamic Republic today has no real channel for that kind of internal reform, which is why it's such a dangerous situation in a way. It's a very brittle situation. You have the hardliners are now in complete control. They're not interested in listening to a lot of these demands simply because they feel that it's a slippery slope, that the West and foreign powers will take advantage of any kind of weakness or perceived weakness. Rightly or wrongly, that's how they feel. And they've seen that again and again in different contexts. And that's kind of where we are.
Thank you for making sense of my somewhat long-winded question there. But as you know from being on the podcast, I try not to talk about countries like their people. China does this. Russia says that. Iran believes this. But it does seem that the government, at least from my vantage point, is unified around this idea of not giving an inch to the protesters. And how much does this have to do with where Iran is now internationally, so isolated?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with that. I mean, I would really want to stress that this level of dissatisfaction and protest that we're seeing is a very domestic story. I would never want to come along and say this is because of this or because of that the US did or whatever. But it is a reality that as Iran has become more isolated, as a number of external factors have played into this. For example, of course, the Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA really vindicated the hardliners and it really gave them a strong political argument, which was basically to say, you see, you can never trust America. We told you, we warned you. And these people like Rouhani and Zarif who wanted to do deals with America, they've been made fools of. You have to not give an inch. At the same time, the maximum pressure campaign and the extreme sanctions that have been placed on Iran, mainly by the Trump administration over the last few years, exacerbated the economic situation. And thus, of course, that plays a significant role in people's level of frustration. And on top of that, Iran finds itself isolated, not just with the US, but globally. I mean, it's finding a new ally in Russia in some ways, but it's a very transactional ally. 15 years ago, Iran in the region was really winning the soft power game in a lot of ways. It had a lot of support on the Arab street because of its backing for Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah during its conflict with Israel. It was seen as thumbing its nose at the imperial powers and so on. Things have changed dramatically. Iran's support for Syria, for Russia, its crackdowns on its own people, a whole range of issues have made it much, much more isolated in the region than it ever has been before. As I said at the outset, it's more unpopular today with its own citizens than it ever has been, and it's more unpopular with the citizens of the region than it ever has been. And so that puts leaders, its government, in a very tight position because all they can do is fall back on their own sort of entrenched hardline positions at this point. That doesn't bode well for the immediate or medium-term future.
I do want to talk about the 2009 protests and how the United States responded to them, but because you just brought up another point about legitimacy and popularity, as I mentioned, I just had a conversation about what's going on in China, and the authoritarian regime there does not provide people civil liberties or political rights, so they've used other ways, economic growth, performance, right, to enhance or maintain some level of legitimacy with the public. What is the basis of the Islamic Republic's legitimacy with the people of Iran?
It's wafer thin at this point, and that's exactly the point. You're right, the Chinese government has, at least until now, and I think largely still can, fall back on this argument. The argument it doesn't even really need to make explicitly, but the argument...
Right. They're in charge.
Right, they're exactly. People's economic well-being and prosperity and material conditions are dramatically better than they were on the whole 20 plus years ago. Not everybody's, but of course they can make that claim for improving and rising living standards and material, et cetera, et cetera. Iran doesn't have that. Life in Iran gets harder and harder every year for a whole bunch of different reasons. And in that context, to continue to maintain this kind of severe control over your population's freedoms, becomes difficult. So I think, that's something that there aren't a lot of really easy answers to right now for Iran.
So the 2009 protests, that was when there was an election. As you note in your book, Mir Hussein Mousavi was the reformist candidate, and it was believed that he was going to win, and then the margin of victory came out, and he was going to lose. And you write here on page 491 of your book, U.S. media openly cheered these events in Iran, treating viewers to 24-hour coverage of what they sometimes described as a second Iranian revolution. So there's that comparison again, just like today, biggest challenge the regime has faced. And on June 16th, 2 days into the disturbances, you write, Secretary of State Clinton asked Twitter to keep its networks up and running for the duration of the crisis. Apparently, the site had been planning routine maintenance shutdowns, as you write here. And then a week later, you write, Obama himself, President Obama, condemned what he called Iran's violence against innocent civilians. But the point of this passage was it allowed the Iranian government to claim Western interference is drumming up popular discontent. I mean, are they doing that again here? And what is the risk of the United States pushing too hard in favor of these protests?
Of course, the Islamic Republic and the Supreme Leader have made the claim that these are, Western-inspired, foreign-inspired plots. I think that rings a lot more hollow than it used to.
I wonder how many people believe that anymore.
Right. I mean, I think that this is just not an American story, and I don't think any serious analyst would say that. Of course, the U.S. has a complicated history with Iran. Of course, I've written about it at length, but that's not as relevant here as it might have been even in 2009. I understand why the Obama administration was at a tight position. It was just a very different time. They were trying to reset relations with the Islamic Republic, and they were mindful of America's complex history of interfering in Iranian domestic affairs, particularly when it comes to protest movements. But times have moved on. Iranians are frustrated and fed up with their own government. It has nothing to do with the United States. Are there foreign elements that are looking for ways or perhaps attempting to fan the flames here? I mean, I'm sure that there are. There always are in these kinds of situations. But these are not foreign-backed plots, and I don't think anyone sees it that way.
Well, I remember in 2009, a lot of people were hoping that the United States would take sides and get behind the protests and topple the regime. I don't hear so much of that anymore, Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know why that is. I think there are probably a number of reasons. One is that the United States is simply not as focused on the Middle East as it used to be. We have a lot of problems of our own, and there are a lot of problems elsewhere in the world. Having said that, there's a pretty vocal and influential chorus of anti-Iran activists in Washington who I'm sure would like to see the regime toppled.
Through their own work, toppled from the outside.
And there are plenty of Iranians, frankly, who would welcome external regime change. I mean, let's just be honest about that. I don't think they're the majority, but I think there is more support for that than there used to be. There is a segment of the Iranian population today that will say, by any means necessary, this government has to go, the system has to go, even if we have to be invaded, whatever. Again, I don't think that's a majority position.
Well, state collapse can bring about myriad problems for the world. I guess, I've always, my limited understanding of the revolution of 1979, John, I've always looked at it from a foreign policy or I guess an international lens, that it was a revolution against the outside world because there had been so much U.S. and foreign interference in Iranian affairs. We can go back to the CIA coup to topple Mossadegh when Iranian democracy was in its infancy in the 1950s. And then, of course, the U.S. support for the hated Shah. But was the Islamic Revolution also... Well, it must have had domestic purposes, right, to bring about a more purified Islamic society, getting to the issue of the morality police, right? And that's what caused these protests. The morality police had a young woman in custody and she died. She may have been murdered by the police or abused to the point of death. So I guess my question after that, another speech, sorry, but my question is, do these morality police go right back to the beginning of the Islamic Republic and what is their purpose?
Yeah, I want to actually, maybe I'll just start by kind of challenging your characterization a little bit of the 1979 revolution, because I don't think it was a revolution against external interference fundamentally, at least not initially. It really was a domestic revolution. It was a revolution against the Shah, first and foremost. The reason that revolution took place and the reason it succeeded was because the country overwhelmingly was fed up with the Shah's regime. People were fed up for a lot of different reasons. There were, as you say, Islamists who felt that things had become too decadent. The government was sort of enslaved to the West and to foreign powers, but also immoral and corrupt and sinful in a lot of ways. There were leftists and Marxists of many different left-wing persuasions, ranging from sort of Maoist-style guerrilla radicals to orthodox pro-Soviet communist parties, through democratic socialists, etc. Many, many different types of left-wing orientations that were fed up with the Shah for a different set of reasons. Also felt that he was too pro-Western, but also that there was too much inequality in the country and so on. There were liberals, centrists, nationalists, Democrats, people who had a pro-Western leaning and were constitutionalists, but felt that the Shah was simply dictatorial. So all of these different groupings united around what they agreed. The one thing they could agree on, which was that the Shah had to go. That the revolution ended up taking an anti-American turn and a more Islamist turn were, not exactly accidents of history, but they're things that happened because of proximate events that took place during the unfolding of the revolution itself. Not to say that there weren't anti-American or Islamist strains in the revolution to begin with, but those by themselves would not have brought down the Shah. That's not what the revolution was really about initially. The reason things went in a more anti-American turn had a lot to do with the admission of the Shah by Jimmy Carter into the United States at a sensitive moment. The Islamist direction had more to do with internal power struggles mostly between radical Marxists and between Islamists, with the Islamists end up out on top. So sorry to go on a massive tangent there myself, but I do feel like that's kind of important to say.
I appreciate you doing that.
No, it's easy to kind of, in retrospect, right, with hindsight, say, oh, this was a sort of anti-American or Islamic revolution. It was an Iranian revolution. It was a revolution against the Shah. But your question about the morality police, yeah, I mean, and I'm not an expert on this aspect of Iranian history, I should say, but from the very, very beginning, the grassroots nature of the Iranian Revolution was such that you had these revolutionary committees. They were known as comités, largely semi-spontaneous grassroots neighborhood committees who took matters into their own hands during the revolutionary chaos, who were armed, who just took responsibility into their own hands for a lot of day-to-day functioning, things as simple as directing traffic, petty policing, but also increasingly policing morality. And as the revolutionaries were victorious in the first year or two after the revolution, there were more and more internal conflicts over which direction the revolution was going to take, whether it was going to go in a more socialist Marxist direction or a more liberal direction or a more Islamist direction. And as the Islamists began to come out on top, and as Khomeini began to issue edicts, most importantly, the pronouncement that women should cover their hair in public and wear proper Islamic hijab, that, committees began to take matters into their own hands. The comités were eventually disbanded in the late 1980s, but a lot of these kinds of functions were formalized much more over the course of the 1980s, and that's where we see the morality police, the Gasht Ershad, coming out. Although there is an open question as to whether they will continue to function quite the way they did before.
Yeah, there was a headline just the other day about maybe they being disbanded, but no one knows for sure.
Yeah, we've got to be careful about that, right? Because this is exactly what I expected would happen. I mean, the last few weeks, the government's been really struggling, I think, just to maintain basic order, and I think they will actually end up doing that. But as they are beginning to, from a purely security perspective, get the upper hand a little bit, I think that's when they are now feeling strong enough to be able to gently put out subtle noises along the lines. They're not going to come out and just say, oh, the morality police is going to be abolished, because that would be a demonstration of weakness. It would look like they're giving ground. That would actually energize the protesters more. At the same time, they would be foolish to turn around and enforce hijab more strictly. They could do that, but I think that would backfire and would also provoke another round of protests. So the smart thing to do is to kind of hedge. And that's what they've done. We haven't seen the police the morality police on the streets in the last few weeks. And what we had the other day was a comment by the judiciary just sort of saying, it's not the judiciary's responsibility to enforce hijab. It's not the same thing as saying that the morality police are going to be disbanded. But it's a sort of putting out feelers and putting out hints like that.
And the Saudis have their own version of this, the Taliban, of course. And I may have fallen into that very American trap of looking at something happening in another country and feeling it was about me, right? But, the Taliban are not necessarily anti-American as much as they are anti-anyone who's not Afghan being in their country trying to run things, and they want to create their own Islamic Garden of Eden or whatever it is, their purified form of Islam. Is that what's happening here? The Shia ayatollahs in Iran, they have their interpretation of Islam that they want to impose on society?
Iran is a post-revolutionary society. That's one thing it has in common with the United States. I know it seems like a strange analogy. I wouldn't want to push it too far because, of course, our revolution here in the United States is much, much older and, of course, very, very different in nature. But the reason I make that analogy is that in all countries, really, that have a sort of foundational myth of any kind, but particularly strongly in post-revolutionary societies, symbolic demonstrations of those kinds of revolutionary ideologies are very, very difficult to just kind of remove. Right? Because there are things that some people feel very passionate about in a lot of different directions. To use the American analogy, right? I mean, it's like, what happens when you suddenly say, well, we don't have to say the Pledge of Allegiance in schools anymore, right? There are certain people that are going to get very, very defensive about that. And there are certain other people who are going to say, that's a great idea. This is a kind of messed up fascistic thing anyway. Why are we even doing this? We should talk about 1619 instead of 1776. And, American history is very much being debated and negotiated as well in our own country. Again, don't want to push this analogy too far, but I think for an Islamic Republic that came to power in a revolution within living memory, something like the morality police is a very visible symbol of their victory in 1980, 81, 82, 83. Their victory over not just the U.S. and the Shah and the Western blah blah blah, but their victory over Marxists and internal enemies. The enforcement of hijab and morality police and all those kinds of things were expressions of their power. Expressions of their victory, that this is our revolution. This is what the revolution is going to look like. So a lot of those people are still alive. Now, is there the same revolutionary fervor for the Islamic Republic today that there was in 1980? Of course not. Quite the opposite. As I said, it's more unpopular today than it's ever been. But you know how hard it is to just abandon symbolic things like that, right? For our country that's more than 200 years old, it's very difficult to abandon certain things, right?
Yeah, a revolution is not just an event. It is a process that plays out over decades. Well, I guess from what I've read, the enforcement of morality has waxed and waned over the years, but it's become more stringent recently since the new president, Raisi, took over. Is that your take on things as well?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, following the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the JCPOA, from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, the moderates and reformists were completely humiliated and embarrassed. Their largest foreign policy legacy, their centerpiece achievement, which was this multilateral deal with 6 nations, just blew up in their faces. They were demonstrably shown to be naive. They stood no chance in the elections. The people felt the sanctions relief was very, very short and fleeting and disappeared, and the economy was in a worse shape than it had been before. And so the hardliners swept to power pretty easily. And it was an election with record low turnout. The level of disillusionment was there to see. So yeah, we have the presidency in the hands of hardliners, the Majlis, the parliament in the hands of hardliners. I mean, every aspect of Iranian government is now in the hands of hardliners.
In 1979, Iranians, I don't want to generalize about a country or any country, but a country like Iran, an ancient culture, diverse people. But there were many pro-Western Iranians in 79. The Shah's modernization program, as you detail in your book, did largely fail, left a lot of people behind. But there were Western elements in Iranian culture, right? So, I mean, it's no surprise to me that people there, many of whom are still alive, as you said, from 79, don't want to live like this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those people left right after the revolution. A lot of them have left, or their children have left more recently. But they're still there. Iran is a diverse and complex society like any other. There's a wide range of political opinions about lots of different things. And as I said, a lot of the people who joined the revolution and overthrew the Shah were pro-Western. They were not anti-Western. They were anti-Shah. They were anti-dictatorship. In fact, many of them simply wanted the Shah to observe the country's own 1906 constitution, which in many ways had been inspired by the Western. It was a constitution that was modeled on the Belgian constitution. And you had, by the way, ayatollahs that even encouraged that. I mean, not so famously, I guess, outside Iran, but the Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani, who was a liberal, moderate, pro-Mossadegh ayatollah who very much believed that the Shah should simply follow the Iranian constitution. You had Ayatollah Shariat Madari, who was the most senior ayatollah in Iran, the grand ayatollah, who said after the revolution, we just need to follow the 1906 constitution. Not every ayatollah was even revolutionary or anti-Western. They were happy for Iran to continue to observe what had been essentially a Western-inspired constitution. So, yeah.
In 1975, 76, even to 77 and 78, American leaders probably did not expect the Shah would be going anywhere, yet he did. So this regime has managed to endure many crises. It is isolated. So I'm wondering, maybe it's possible that it will fall, but I don't know. That's like an impossible thing to predict. That wasn't really much of a question, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
No, that's fine. I mean, look, I think the long-term prognosis for the Islamic Republic is not good, barring some kind of unexpected event that black swan type event that we're not aware of. I think it's going to really struggle to maintain legitimacy. These kinds of issues are going to keep surfacing, keep bubbling up, these kinds of popular frustrations in one form or another. And it doesn't have a really good answer to any of these things right now. If you're asking for my predictions for the immediate future, they're the same that they have been at every point in the last few weeks. And I know a lot of people will disagree with me about this, but my consistent prediction has been that these protests, while they represent a very, very deep seam of frustration, are not an immediate threat to the livelihood of the Islamic Republic. Not an immediate threat. I want to emphasize that. I do think there is a medium-term and long-term threat. But I think from an immediate, purely security perspective, the Islamic Republic will actually get the upper hand, and these protests will be quashed from a purely security perspective. I don't think that the emotions that inspired them or the feelings of frustration are going to go away. What I think the regime will do, as I've said, is to sort of look the other way on hijab enforcement. It's going to be, I think, like marijuana legislation in the United States, on the books, but widely, flouted. Already, from what I understand, women are going about their business all over Tehran and other cities in Iran without hijab, without headscarves, and no one is doing anything about it. And I think that's probably how it's going to continue to be. But I do want to say this, in terms of what will actually happen, I'm not terribly optimistic. And the reason for this is because there are only a handful of possible scenarios right now. And this has been the case for the last few weeks. One scenario, which is the one I'm most worried about, is that protesters will not back down, bloodshed will increase, that there will be a really entrenched, almost civil war type situation, like a Syria 2011 type of situation. I don't think that's terribly likely right now, but I think that is one possibility. If both sides don't back down and, blood begets more blood, which sometimes tends to happen, and emotions get even more heightened. Another possibility is a sort of coup d'etat led from within. It would not be, as some people hope, some sort of military coup that replaces the Islamic Republic with a democracy. It would be led largely by the Revolutionary Guards, which is the most powerful military force in the country. They are, for the most part, still deeply committed to the concept of velayat al-faqih, the guardianship of the jurisprudent, which is basically the system of the Islamic Republic. And they are, if anything, are likely to bring in a perhaps more secular, but ultimately more militant and more brutal dictatorship.
Things can actually get worse before
things can get worse. The other possibility, which is the one that I think most people want, which is this kind of peaceful transition to a liberal multi-party democracy. I don't see a clear pathway to that right now. The idea that this can be done without any kind of external interference or volatility or chaos, that Iran will simply peacefully make the transition to become this wonderful democratic society that we would all want to see.
That's difficult.
It's difficult for me to see that. I don't see a path. I don't see a kind of organized movement that's going to bring that about. I don't see a clear opposition leader. I don't see a real route towards that.
There aren't a lot of, I'm sorry to interrupt, John, there aren't a lot of independent civil society organizations in Iran, the pillars of what you would call pluralistic society, right, because they've been living under an authoritarian regime.
Right. Right. No, but it's by design. And the Islamic Republic has done a very good job of entrenching itself at every level of society. A significant percentage of the Iranian public benefits from the Islamic Republic. I mean, they may not like it, but they benefit from it. I mean, at least a third of the country probably. I mean, in some way or another, materially benefits from the Islamic Republic, by which I mean they might swear at their leaders and say these people are a bunch of horrible, they're corrupt, they're dictators. But you know what? I know how to navigate this system. I know how to make it work for me. I don't want more instability and chaos and people dying on the streets, for something that's not really clear.
Same reasons why Gorbachev's economic reforms failed in the sclerotic Soviet economy. There were just too many people who had an interest in the status quo. As bad as it was for everyone else, it benefited them.
Right. That's not to say that the Islamic Republic is somehow popular. I would not want to make that claim. But I think there's a reason why we haven't been seeing demonstrations in the millions. We've been seeing them in the hundreds or in the thousands, but not in the hundreds of thousands or millions. I think there are many reasons for that. I think the security forces have been very good at dispersing large gatherings. So people are gathering in smaller, more guerrilla-style protests. But I don't think that's the only reason. I do think that a lot of Iranian society is nervous to go out and risk its neck without knowing exactly where this is going.
Two more items. They're related. Number one, why Russia right now? Why is Iran helping Russia's war effort?
I mean, I don't know that they have. Where else are they going to go? I think that Iran has no real allies at this point, and it hasn't for a long time. Its economy is. The Islamic Republic is in a much, much weaker position than it has ever been. In some ways it was weaker when it first came to power, but it had the people behind it, in a kind of emotional way. And it was at war. It was invaded by Saddam Hussein, which of course created a bloodbath that kind of unified everyone. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. I mean, it really entrenched the Islamic Republic. It was born in the midst of that bloodshed. And in the years since, it has slowly struggled to maintain its popularity and legitimacy, and that's got worse and worse and worse. And it has come under more and more international pressure and sanctions. And there's a new generation now that has no memory of the Shah. I mean, actually, at this point, I would say probably a majority of the Iranian public has no real memory of the Shah's regime. So the country what doesn't work well is very much blamed on, as it should be, on the ruling authorities. Iran's only real ally is the government of Bashar Assad in Syria. And that, of course, is not exactly a very strong or powerful, meaningful ally. The Russian friendship is pretty transactional and pretty instrumental. It's not a real friendship or alliance. I mean, interestingly, ironically, also, Russia now has a lot to learn from Iran. I mean, the US has placed such severe sanctions on Iran over the past decade or so, but largely outside the international spotlight. But one of the interesting things about that is that Iran has learned how to evade those sanctions, probably better than any other country, and has a special kind of skill that it has a lot to teach the Russians about how to get around sanctions. And of course, Russia, despite all of its international isolation, is still a pretty powerful ally to have if you can cultivate it. So
we've talked about Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra a bit on the podcast in the past, and Reagan's intentions were good. He wanted to establish a better relationship with Iran. He saw no need for both states to be in a permanent state of hostility.
Without Iran's cooperation, we cannot bring an end to the Persian Gulf War. Without Iran's concurrence, there can be no enduring peace in the Middle East. For 10 days now, the American and world press have been full of reports and rumors about this initiative and these objectives. Now, my fellow Americans, there's an old saying that nothing spreads so quickly as a rumor. So I thought it was time to speak with you directly, to tell you firsthand about our dealings with Iran. As Will Rogers once said, rumor travels faster, but it don't stay put as long as truth. So let's get to the facts. The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
The way he went about doing that, well, that's another story for another podcast, trading arms through Israel for hostages, etc. I mention that because I would love to see the end of this mutual hostility. And in foreign relations, there was this idea once used by Nixon's people called linkage. That is, we're going to link, say, the nuclear talks with the 5 European states and the United States, or the Iran nuclear deal, link negotiations over that to human rights issues or whatever other issue it is. And Reagan was not a fan of linkage. Reagan wanted to continue to negotiate with Gorbachev and the Soviets, despite them doing a lot of other things he did not approve of. Today, it seems like Iran and the United States are separated by a Grand Canyon. It's getting wider, the chasm.
No, it is. And linkage is probably not a really obvious or viable strategy right now.
I'm not sure what the Biden administration is pursuing as far as linking the nuclear talks to what's going on in Iran and a number of other things. But go ahead.
Yeah, and in fact, if anything, I mean, we saw Tony Blinken making a statement the other day about how, we'd still like to pursue some sort of nuclear deal with Iran. And those kinds of statements come under a lot of criticism from people who are very focused on what they believe is a revolution that's about to bring about regime change. And if you really believe that, and for the reasons I've outlined, I don't happen to believe that. I don't happen to believe that we are imminently on the cusp of regime change. But if you do really believe that, and I respect that if you do believe that, I can understand why you would say this is not the time to pursue nuclear negotiations. Lending legitimacy to a regime that is on its last legs, that is up against the ropes. I understand that point of view. Even if you, as I don't, if you don't believe that the regime is a house of cards that's about to collapse, even if you don't believe that, there's a fair argument that this is probably not the time to pursue nuclear diplomacy because it does seem to lend a certain stamp of legitimacy. But at the same time, it's tricky because it's not like Iran's nuclear program is just being paused while all of this is taking place. I mean, it still proceeds apace. My personal view on this, and I wrote an op-ed for the LA Times a few months ago about this, is I actually do think that the Iran nuclear negotiations should be abandoned, but for a completely different set of reasons. Because Iran has already basically become a nuclear-capable state. It's kind of a mockery. These negotiations are kind of pointless at this point. They're irrelevant. They're a distraction. I think we need a fresh start with Iran, a fresh approach to diplomacy that treats it as a much larger diplomatic and political challenge. In that sense, I think I probably have more in common with regime change activists than anyone might think, actually. I think that we need to step back and really look at this as a big kind of holistic issue. And like, what are we actually going to do? How are we going to approach Iran? And that can be a discussion. It can be a dialogue. It can, we can have a policy review about it. But this idea that we should fixate on the JCPOA seems very strange to me, because it's like, what are we even trying to achieve? If Iran wanted a nuclear bomb at this point, it could have it very, very quickly. And they have not made that decision.
Well, thank you for a coherent answer to my not very coherent question. And I know I did not have to explain linkage to you as a historian, but for the benefit of the audience, I brought it up. Didn't really explain it all that well, but either way, John Ghazvinian, thank you.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, Russia's war in Ukraine is going nowhere, it seems, except into a long, hard winter. The West's support for Ukraine remains strong, and historian Timothy Snyder, among others, is comparing this situation to Munich in 1938, a so-called appeasement test. And he's comparing Putin to Adolf Hitler. We're going to dismantle the Munich fallacy with Cathal Nolan next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.